Okay, let's move on then. Vanessa, Iraq's foreign ministry announcing that Syria is back in the club.
Yes, so on the 7th of May, and this has kind of set off a whole round of reactions from the West, predominantly from the US and the UK, which I'll come on to. The spokesman for Iraq's foreign ministry, Ahmed al-Sahaf, announced that the Arab foreign ministers who met on Sunday behind closed doors in Cairo have agreed on the return of Syria to the Arab League after nearly 12 years of suspension. I do have to add to this that many of these countries, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Jordan, even Iraq, are also aware that they need to start pivoting east because their countries are liable to be targeted, particularly Egypt, with the explosion of events in Sudan and probably this kind of warfare to continue in Africa, as we've discussed before. But also a number of other events have gone on. It's difficult to cover all of them, but I'll take out the main ones. So Iraq, on the 10th of May, signed an agreement with Iran to expand energy ties and establish a joint office aimed at overlooking cooperation between the two countries, the Iraqi oil ministry announced, coming as part of Iranian oil minister Javad Alji's visit to Baghdad. This, of course, also seeks to fall into the de-dollarization project because, of course, the US has been sanctioning billions in Iraqi funds, which are owing to Iran, to impede cooperation between Iraq and Iran. 1/3 of electricity and gas comes from Iran to Iraq. And of course, more recently, the US has been triggering ISIS terrorist fighters to attack electrical facilities in Iraq. Many people are not aware of that. They have done that historically in Syria, but also in Iraq. Now, the next bit of good news, I've written about this in greater detail at my Substack. If people want to go there, it's the last article that was published. There is talk between Syria and Iraq of reopening the Kirkuk to Banyas pipeline. Now, historically, this pipeline was actually established in 1952 by the Bechtel Corporation, who were known probably for their savage exploitation of the 2003 unlawful aggression by the US and its allies against Iraq. And then basically it has a long history, which I detail in my article. But basically it was bombed by the US in the first Gulf War and in the second Gulf War, and in 2010 reopened. But then when the 2011 regime change war started, basically ISIS were introduced into the areas where the pipeline ran, and that made it impossible to keep it running. So the US interference to prevent this pipeline has been extensive throughout history. What will the pipeline do? It will increase the alliance between Russia and Iran, because Iran is looking at connecting to the pipeline from Iran to Iraq. It means that Iraq can bypass the Kurdish Contras that are occupying oil fields in Iraq. 12% of its oil produce comes from Kirkuk. And it means an activation of the Syrian oil processing industry in Banyas. It means an increase in trade to the maritime port connected to Banyas, etc. So it's a kind of win-win situation for Syria and Iraq, which means, of course, the US will try its best to put obstacles in the way, including sanctions and the triggering of ISIS terrorist groups. On the 10th of May, we had the quartet meeting that I mentioned between Iran, Russia, Turkey, and Syria to discuss the so-called normalization of relations between Turkey and Syria. A lot of people have published the next photo saying, look at the body language, and I do have to agree. On the left, you have His Excellency Faisal Muqdad, the Foreign Minister of Syria, and on the right, Mevlut Cavusoglu. I'm probably murdering the Turkish names, and I apologize to anyone from Turkey who's watching. And you can see there that Mcdad has a far more in-power, bullish body language compared to a rather diminutive Cavusoglu in the photo. Now, of course, we also know that Syria has dug its heels in. It has the red line that it will not normalize relations without Turkish withdrawal, both of its own military and of its terrorist proxies from Syrian territory. But however, let's look at what Sergei Lavrov said after the meeting. The process of normalization of relations between Turkey and the Syrian Arab Republic opens up new opportunities for the Astana format, which was set up in 2017 to try and find a political resolution to the crisis in Syria. According also to the foreign minister's statements, there is to be a military quartet set up in Syria between the four countries to try and also resolve the military situation. That's not mentioned in these comments, but moving on to the next slide. Facilitating the safe and voluntary return of refugees to Syria is a key principle. Well, of course, it is also for Erdogan. 5 million Syrian refugees on Turkish territory. That's a big electoral campaign strategy to get at least 1 million of those refugees returned to Syria. A roadmap for a settlement in Syria should be prepared for the next meeting of the foreign ministries of Turkey, Syria, Iran, and the Russian Federation, and later it will be presented to the presidents. The launch of the Turkish-Syrian normalization process has a positive impact on the situation in the region and the Middle East as a whole, the reasons for which have been discussed previously, but obviously for NATO, the last thing they want is normalization between Syria and Turkey, hence the interference, in my opinion, in the elections in Turkey. Now, an interesting thing that Lavrov did say, and I have also received information that this has been happening for some time. According to our data, the Americans have started to create the so-called, and I've put in brackets, new Free Syrian Army near the Syrian city of Raqqa, engaging local Arab tribes along with militants from ISIS and other terrorist organizations. The goal is clear: to use these militants against Syria's legitimate authorities in order to, again, I've added, destabilize the situation in the country. So in response to Syria's rejoining the Arab League, the club, as you called it, Mike, what is the US and, of course, the UK doing? Reigniting the terrorist war against Syrian Arab Army and its allies. So on the 10th of May, we had the Syrian Ministry of Interior put out a statement that a police vehicle had exploded within the compound of Barzeh police station. Sorry, that's
I'm sorry that the text is. Yeah,
no,
sorry
it's okay. In Damascus. Now, until now, they haven't issued a statement as to what was the cause. But, you know, we've had on and off a number of terrorist sleeper cell IED attacks and detonations in Damascus. So that's another clear connection to the US displeasure. And then finally, US lawmakers introduce a bill to combat normalization with Syria's Assad. So let's have a look at what that bill entails. A bipartisan group of US lawmakers introduced a bill on Thursday intended to bar the American government from recognizing Bashar al-Assad as Syria's president and to enhance Washington's ability to impose sanctions, a warning to other countries normalizing relations with Assad. The bill would prohibit the government from recognizing or normalizing relations with any Syrian government led by Assad, who is under US sanctions, and expands on, I didn't understand how they could expand on, the Caesar Act, which imposed a tough round of sanctions on Syria in 2020 under the Trump administration. But here we go. The bill's provisions include a requirement that the Secretary of State provide Congress with a strategy for countering normalization with Assad's government, including a list of diplomatic meetings between Syria's government and Turkey, the UAE, Egypt, and others. So that means also Jordan, Iraq, etc., every year for 5 years. The legislation would also pave the way for sanctions to be imposed on airports that allow landings by Syrian Arab Airlines and another carrier, Sham Wings. If passed, the bill would also require a review of transactions, including donations over $50,000 in areas of Syria held by Assad's government by anyone in Turkey, the UAE, Egypt, and several other countries. So, the US is a very sore loser. That's about the only comment I can make on that.
Yeah.
And the question I have is, what is the remedy for lifting sanctions against Syria? What does the U.S. want? Do they want them to hand over the keys to Damascus Gate to ISIS? Is that part of the requirement for lifting sanctions, or what? Have they articulated what they actually want?
I mean, the amazing thing is, all of these measures are only going to hasten the de-dollarization. And as Marco Rubio said, as soon as de-dollarization comes in, their economic warfare becomes null and void, right? So just as they're complaining about how Russia's actions alone trigger the need to supply weapons to Ukraine, everything that they're doing in the region and in Syria is triggering exactly what they don't want to happen, which is pan-Arabism, the expansion of relations between regional countries with Iran, et cetera, et cetera. So everything they're doing is pushing Syria to do exactly what they don't want them to do.
Or what they say they don't want them to do.
Well, yeah.
I mean, it's I might be being a bit cynical here, Vanessa, but I see them building an enemy for themselves.
Yeah.
The regime change is what they want.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what they want. They want regime change. That's it. That's the condition for lifting sanctions. Get rid of the government.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And so what they'll do, of course, is they'll try to annex other parts of Syria. So if they bring in the opposition candidate in Turkey, potentially they will try to get him to annex northern territory. They will continue pouring millions into the northwest, into Abu Jolani, into their cleaned up Al-Qaeda leader party. And then in the northeast, they'll try and annex territory, which Victoria Nuland has already spoken publicly about, for the so-called autonomous region for the Kurdish countries. So, yeah, if they can't achieve regime change, what they'll achieve is the control of almost all borders of Syria by hostile states and a centralized, marooned Syria.
Yep.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Vanessa.